A subway ride, a small gesture, and an entire train car transformed. Barron Trump's simple act of kindness sparked a wave of stories, hope, and connections that no one saw coming. The subway car rattled violently as it sped through the tunnels of New York City, the flickering overhead lights casting a cold, monotonous glow on its passengers. It was a typical midweek evening, and the train was packed with weary office workers, students drained after long school days, professionals glued to their phones, and an elderly man gripping the overhead rail with shaky hands, struggling to keep his balance as the train jolted sharply. Among the crowd sat a young man, seemingly ordinary, dressed in a simple hoodie and faded blue jeans. He sat quietly in a corner, engrossed in a book, blending into the sea of passengers, as if he were just another face in the crowd. But a closer look would reveal that this was no ordinary commuter. It was Barron Trump, the youngest member of America's most famous political family, quietly experiencing a slice of ordinary life, collecting stories and experiences far from the spotlight. No bodyguards, no glamour, just a young man, much like anyone else. As the train suddenly swerved, Barron looked up, startled, and saw an elderly man lose his balance. The man's hands slipped from the rail, and his frail body wavered precariously. In that split second, it looked as if he would fall. Without hesitation, Barron leapt to his feet, moving swiftly and instinctively toward the man. "Please, take my seat," Barron said, his voice calm yet firm. He gestured toward the empty spot he had just vacated. The elderly man looked at him, surprise flashing in his eyes before they softened with gratitude. "You're very kind," the man rasped, his voice hoarse but sincere. He hesitated for a moment, then sat down, his trembling hands clutching an old wooden cane. As he settled into the seat, the lines of weariness etched into his face began to soften. A faint smile appeared, and somewhere in his eyes, a glimmer of recognition seemed to spark. Around them, the other passengers began to notice. A few glanced from Barron to the elderly man, their curiosity piqued. Whispers rippled through the car. "Is that?" a teenager murmured to her friend, her phone half raised to snap a picture. Before she could act, the elderly man broke the silence, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You know," he began, his tone laced with nostalgia, "you remind me of someone very special." Barron smiled gently, his warm eyes meeting the man's. "It would be an honor if that were true," he replied, his voice inviting yet unassuming, as if encouraging the man to continue. The elderly man bowed his head slightly, his aged hands tracing the smooth handle of his cane. "He was a sculptor," the man began, his gaze drifting toward the scratched train window, where blurred city lights flickered past. His hands could turn a lifeless block of stone into something that spoke to people about the city, its people, their struggles, and their joys. Barron leaned in slightly, his interest genuine and apparent. "He sounds like an extraordinary man," he said softly, his voice filled with admiration. The man nodded, his features shifting as though the memories were coming alive before him. "We once built a sculpture together, right in the heart of the square. It was two hands, one holding gently, the other reaching outward, as if to remind people that empathy and giving always have a place. But then, the square was demolished, and the sculpture disappeared. Time has a way of erasing everything, doesn't it?" The train car fell into a profound hush, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks the only sound breaking the stillness. Barron stood silently, his thoughtful expression reflecting the weight of the man's story. It was clear he understood the deeper meaning behind the words. "Do you still sculpt?" Barron asked, his tone low and considerate. The man shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. "Not anymore." These hands, he held them up briefly before letting them fall back onto his cane. "They're not what they used to be. But the memories, they're as vivid as ever. Every line, curves as if they're waiting to be brought to life again." The man's words hung in the air, casting a spell of contemplation over the passengers, and in that shared silence, something intangible began to shift. A young man sitting across the aisle cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice tentative yet curious. "Were you talking about the monument on Westwood Street? The one with the two hands reaching up as if supporting each other?" The elderly man's eyes lit up with a hint of surprise. "You know that one?" he asked. The young man nodded. "It's still there, though it's faded over the years. When I was a kid, my dad used to take me to see it. He'd say, 'Those hands, one is for lifting, and the other is for receiving strength.' I didn't understand it back then, but now I do." His voice softened, and a shy smile flickered across his face. "That's right. That's the one," the elderly man replied quietly, his gaze softening as if he were lost in a memory. "I sculpted it with a close friend, a man whose face always carried a deep sense of compassion." Standing nearby, Barron Trump silently observed the exchange, his thoughtful eyes moving between the young man and the elderly man. A faint, genuine smile formed on his face. He seemed to grasp the significance of the story being shared. Around them, the other passengers grew quiet, as though drawn into the unfolding moment. Something about the story kindled a silent connection among everyone in the crowded subway car. It no longer felt like a collection of strangers, but a shared moment of humanity. The usual indifference of the subway atmosphere faded, replaced by an expectant stillness, as if everyone was waiting for the story to continue. A middle-aged woman holding a bouquet of lavender spoke next. "I know that monument too," she said, her voice tinged with wistfulness. "I always thought those hands were a symbol of something lost, but hearing you now, they seem more like they're holding on to something that can't be let go." The elderly man's lips curved into a small smile, and his eyes sparkled a little brighter. "That's the thing about art," he said warmly. "It doesn't just exist in stone or on walls, it lives in people. If it's touched your heart, then it's fulfilled its purpose." His words hung in the air, so profound that the car fell completely silent. A young boy sitting on his father's lap pointed at the elderly man. "Did you make the eagle statue in the park too?" he asked, his voice filled with excitement and awe. The boy's father chuckled, gently patting his head. "He loves that statue," the father added. "Every time we go to the park, it's the first thing he runs to." The elderly man's face lit up, and his smile grew deeper, radiating pride. "Yes, I made that one too," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia and pride. "It's one of my favorites. We finished it during a harsh winter when the whole city felt heavy and grey. We wanted to remind people that hope's wings are always there, even on the darkest days." Barron shifted his weight slightly, still holding onto the handrail, his full attention on the man. "It sounds like you didn't just create art," he said slowly, his voice laced with emotion. "You brought the city hope and renewal." The elderly man's eyes glistened briefly, but he quickly lowered his gaze to his trembling hands. "I never thought of it that way," he whispered. "I suppose I was just trying to hold on to a little mite for myself." The man's words seemed to open a door, inviting the other passengers to share. A man in a crisp suit, who had been silently listening, cleared his throat. "I used to pass by the Westwood Monument every day on my way to work. Life was tough back then, but that monument reminded me that maybe I wasn't alone." A young woman with earbuds dangling from her neck chimed in. "I moved to New York last year and felt completely lost. But when I saw those hands, it felt like someone was telling me to keep going, even when it seemed impossible." Barron nodded, his eyes sweeping across the passengers as he absorbed their words. It wasn't just the monument, it was the stories tied to it, how it had quietly imprinted itself on their lives. He turned back to the elderly man, his voice calm yet filled with admiration. "You've left a legacy greater than you realize," he said. Then, with a thoughtful pause, Barron added, "Would you be open to leaving another one?" The elderly man's eyes widened slightly. "Do you mean that?" Barron smiled gently. "I know of a community project that helps children facing tough circumstances. If you're willing, I'd love to connect you with them. You could teach them sculpture or art. I'd be happy to rally support and fund the initiative. What do you think?" A radiant smile spread across the elderly man's face. "Of course," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "That might be the most meaningful thing I've done in my final years." "Thank you." Barron replied with quiet sincerity. "It's my pleasure. May I take down your address and phone number? I'll reach out next week." The elderly man shared his contact information, his voice quivering with gratitude. "I never imagined I'd still have the chance to use my small abilities to make a difference for others." Barron's gaze softened, and he replied gently, "Anytime kindness is shared, it's always the right time, and it's always meaningful. I wish you health and joy." The subway car swayed slightly, but no one seemed to notice. The strangers, now bound by shared stories, felt more like companions. Each tale layered new meaning onto the moment, as if the train was carrying not just people, but shared humanity. A teenage girl sitting next to her grandfather spoke up, her voice clear and reflective. "My grandpa always tells me to notice the little things around me," she said. "I think this is one of them." The elderly man smiled, his eyes shimmering as he looked around the subway car. "I never thought a small monument or a simple gesture could create something this profound," he said softly, his voice catching slightly. Barron nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "Kindness always finds a way to grow," he said. The subway slowed for the next station, the screech of brakes momentarily breaking the spell, but the energy inside the car remained palpable. Even as passengers stepped off the train, they left behind a sense of connection for those who stayed. Sometimes it's the smallest things that carry the most weight. At that moment, a teenage girl sitting beside her grandfather pulled out her phone. "I want to capture this moment," she said, her finger hovering over the camera button. The elderly man chuckled softly, raising a hand to stop her. "No need," he said, his smile carrying a playful glint. "This moment is ours. It doesn't need to be recorded." The subway car slowly entered another dark tunnel, the overhead lights flickering briefly before stabilizing. Barron Trump's face lit with curiosity. "Do you think you'll ever go back to sculpting?" he asked, his voice warm and encouraging. The elderly man hesitated, his wrinkled hands trembling slightly, as if testing the thought of holding familiar tools once again. "Maybe," he finally said, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. "Perhaps there's still something left in me." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the passengers. The man's quiet determination, paired with Barron's gentle encouragement, seemed to ignite an indescribable feeling within everyone. It was as if his potential return to art symbolized something greater, a reminder that it's never too late to revisit the things that give life meaning. As the train began to slow for the final station, a young woman standing near the door turned to Barron. "We needed this," she said simply, her words carrying weight. "All of us. Thank you." Barron offered her a warm smile, the same one he had given the elderly man earlier. "I didn't do much," he replied humbly, his modesty deepening the passengers' appreciation for the moment. The train came to a complete stop, and the passengers reluctantly began to gather their belongings. Yet no one rushed to leave. They lingered, as if stepping off the train would shatter the fragile beauty of what had just unfolded. This moment felt like a gift, one they weren't ready to let go of just yet. When the doors opened at the final stop, the passengers exited slowly, one by one. Their faces reflected a mix of contemplation and quiet satisfaction. The elderly man rose carefully, gripping his well-worn cane, his eyes filled with gratitude as he looked up at Barron. "Thank you," he said, his deep voice carrying more than just words, not just for the seat but for listening. "That's the most precious gift anyone can give." Barron extended a steadying hand, helping the man maintain his balance as the train shifted slightly. "It was my honor," Barron said sincerely. "Take care of yourself, and if you decide to sculpt again, I believe the world will be a better place because of it." The elderly man chuckled softly, his eyes reflecting a small but profound hope. "I'll think about it," he said. As he stepped off the train, he paused, turning back to Barron one last time. "You know," he said, his voice resonating through the thinning crowd, "you remind me of an old friend, someone who always carried kindness in his eyes. Maybe kindness always finds its way to the right places." Barron responded with a quiet smile, saying nothing more, letting the man's words linger in the air. The remaining passengers followed the elderly man's lead, their steps lighter, their demeanors more at ease. It was as if they had rediscovered a part of their humanity that had been buried under the rush of daily life. Barron stayed in the car for a moment longer, silently watching them leave. He adjusted the strap of his bag, and as the train grew still, stepped onto the platform, blending into the crowd like any other commuter. Yet his presence lingered in the minds of those who had shared that ride. Stories about the young man who gave up his seat and listened so intently began to spread among families and friends. The sculptures the elderly man had mentioned found new admirers as people sought out the forgotten pieces of art. Acts of kindness, inspired by a single, simple gesture, began to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond that subway car. The teenage girl sitting next to her grandfather later posted on social media. Her words were simple but powerful. "Today, I saw a stranger remind us all what kindness looks like. It's contagious. Pass it on." The post quickly went viral, but Barron never saw it. He didn't need to. The impact of his actions had already taken root, spreading in ways no one could have predicted. And perhaps that's the lesson. In a world that often rushes by, a single moment of kindness can remind us to slow down and reconnect. Sometimes it only takes one person to spark a change, a gesture, a story, a shared moment. So the next time you're out in the world, look around. Offer your seat, share a smile. Listen. You never know whose life you might touch or how it might come back to touch yours. Together, let's spread the power of kindness, one story at a time. If this story has touched your heart, we'd love for you to share its message by liking and sharing it with your friends, helping us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to us and allows us to create more meaningful stories for you. Don't forget to share your thoughts about the story and let us know which city you're watching from. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you in our next story.